Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of the Rock Does Dishes 2 podcast. My name is Adam, and in this episode, I'll be discussing the government's role in all things related to new fathers and the issues that they face in balancing employment and parental responsibilities. So I think the best place to kick this episode off is to actually discuss what exists as far as government policy related to entitlements for new fathers or fathers returning to the workforce. So what's in store for new dads as far as government implemented entitlements? There's the Dad and Partner Pay Scheme, introduced in 2013, that provides eligible dads 2 weeks of paid leave at the national minimum wage of $740.60 before tax. And this has been implemented to allow time for the father to assist in caring for the child, allow time to bond with the child, support your partner, and also share some experiences as a family. And as we all know, 2 weeks is really all you need to create, lifelong unbreakable bonds with your child, and also for the mum or primary carer to, get on top of things and work out how to actually look after a newborn child, maybe for the first time ever. So in order to receive the 2 weeks dad and partner pay, you need to have a couple of things in place in order to be eligible. So you need to have been working in some capacity for the last 10 months, whether that's, full-time, part-time, casual, or self-employed. You need to have had a taxable income of $150,000 or less in the previous financial year, and you must be an Australian resident. There's also the 52 weeks of unpaid leave available to fathers who have been with an employer for 12 months or longer, which is enforced by legislation, so your employer cannot refuse a request for leave or discriminate you based on a request for leave, provided that you meet the eligibility criteria. So one of the main features of this leave entitlement is that your employer must hold a position for you. They can't simply just replace you, which allows you to step back into your job once your 52 weeks is up, essentially. Beyond this 52 weeks of unpaid leave, you can also request by law an additional 52 weeks of unpaid leave, but your boss is also legally allowed to say, no, you may not have that extra year of leave as well. So I think beyond pointing to the fact that there are pretty minimal entitlements legislated for fathers in Australia, the issues are really stemming from some deeper ingrained problems that I think are really worth exploring. Like almost any policy that's ever existed, there are downfalls and issues with the current parental leave policy framework in Australia that can make it very difficult for fathers and families trying to juggle those multiple roles they carry out in the world, whether that's worker, student, parent, you name it. And so what appears to be the underlying structural problem with leave entitlements for fathers is that we're still stuck in the male breadwinner and female carer model, which is then reflected in the primary and secondary carer model in legislation, which just doesn't make sense for modern families who often have both parents working or forging a career and needing to manage that with parenting. It appears to me that most of the issues we see from a policy standpoint seem to be as a result of this underlying adherence to the traditional family model. The current framework essentially creates a trap in which a father has to make a choice: sacrifice career or financial ambitions to take on a more parenting active lifestyle, or remain engaged in the labour market to provide that financial security to the family unit. And given the data surrounding economic disparity between mothers and fathers, the latter option is deemed the most viable option in most families, with 85% of fathers taking less than 4 weeks parental leave and only 5% of fathers taking on the primary carer responsibilities. I think what's worth briefly mentioning is the carry-on effects from this model too, where obviously this framework suppresses a mother's ability to have engagement in the workforce, or at least one where there aren't significant limitations, and also within the family, with research suggesting that increased father involvement has developmental, educational, and behavioural benefits for children. So right there, even from a productivity standpoint, which seems to be where a lot of the parental leave policies and legislation have stemmed from, you'd imagine a legislated parenting/working model which contributes to well-developed, well-educated children who then go on to become productive, contributing members of society would be attracted to long-term national strategy for essentially any country, right? Another big problem I've consistently come across in my research is the actual source for where policies or recommendations that have influenced policies have stemmed from. In my research, it just felt like over and over again, all the really influential policy recommendations have come from a standpoint of economic, productivity, and labour force mobilisation, and less so from a beneficial family or social standpoint. Not to say that there isn't those policy recommendations, because there are, and I will be talking about them later, but it just seems that in Australia, they still aren't the loudest voice in policy influencing for some reason, and I think it's important to know why that is. I think what's telling is that the source of current entitlements such as the 18 weeks paid parental leave for primary carers and the dad and partner pay scheme came from recommendations within a 2009 Productivity Commission report, whose main focus was the economic and productivity impacts of potential parental leave policies. And again, even in 2020, the focus point hasn't changed within government, in my opinion. So the newest relevant policy put forward in Parliament, which is for increased flexibility for the current leave arrangements, has been done so from recommendations stemming out of the Women's Economic Security Package, which is part of the 2019 Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook. And it's a policy purely aimed at increasing women's workforce participation. So with all these words getting thrown around, economic, productivity, workforce participation, and fiscal outlook, you almost forget what we're talking about here as mothers and children, families and fathers. It really takes away from the issues that these everyday fathers and families are dealing with and balancing work and care, when the primary intention of all the parental leave policies in place are still aimed at those economic indicators. So the research has shown that in order to have effective parental leave policies for fathers, it needs to have four things. It must be non-transferable, meaning that only the father can take the leave. It must be highly compensated. It must be flexible, and it must be supported with a government campaign aimed at encouraging a father-friendly culture. Just to provide an example of where some of these policies are being pushed politically, I thought I'd have a look at the Australian Greens Party as a party generally considered somewhat progressive in its social policies. What I found that was specific to father leave entitlements, they've only addressed one of the four criteria outlined for an effective framework for fathers, which was the highly compensated category I just mentioned. So they propose that rather than the minimum wage paid to fathers during the paid parental leave period, that fathers are compensated at 100% of their salary. So it's obviously an increase from that minimum national wage, but I think what's important to point out is that they haven't proposed any structural changes, and they're still really confined to that breadwinner carer model, which is in keeping with essentially every prominent political party or policy influence in Australia. And I guess to swing the pendulum over to some of the more conservative parties, it was actually very difficult to find anything at all specific to father-friendly policy. I guess if they're really stuck in that traditional family model, then why change anything? The newest bill put forward in Parliament, which I mentioned earlier, has been put forward by the Centre Alliance Party, which is a political party with 2 Senate seats and classes itself as a party with, you guessed it, centred policies. So this bill, it's called the Pay Parental Leave Amendment Flexibility Measures Bill 2020, and it's proposing that the last 6 weeks of the 18-week paid primary care leave can be taken any time in the first 2 years of a child's life, and that this 6 weeks can also be traded to the secondary carer, or in our case, traded to dad so that mum can get back to work. So it hasn't increased leave entitlements or anything like that. It's only really just shuffled some things around and given a father the potential for 6 weeks of paid leave if the mother chooses to return to work, which is, I previously mentioned, has generally not been the most financially viable option for families. So I think it's going to be interesting to see in the coming years how this flexible 6 weeks will be used and who will use them. So whether dad will take them or mum will keep them. So with all the policy and political jargon out the way, where is the family-orientated research and policy recommendations coming from? The Australian Institute of Family Studies and International Comparisons were 2 areas where I was able to find some research and policy proposals upon which to build a foundation for my recommendations that I'll be providing in the final episode. One really interesting article I came across suggests that as incentives for mothers and women to return to work have increased, policies that effectively supplement the carer duties have not increased, which has created a black hole that sometimes the father needs to fill while managing other responsibilities. And this has been deemed quite difficult. So one way around this issue that's been proposed is creating longer and specific non-transferable leave entitlements for fathers. Another area that's been pointed out in research which I'll keep really brief because you'll be hearing more about this in episode 2 with Jack, I'm sure, is an effective government-implemented campaign aimed at challenging some of the negative stereotypes about fathers taking on those parental duties. And this is most certainly a cultural issue in Australia. So while data does show that fathers are really keen to jump into a more active parenting role, cultural adherence seems to be negatively impacting upon which policies are getting through in Parliament, and therefore preventing fathers from doing this. And so it's been suggested that the government needs to do something about this through public campaigns aimed at people and aimed at businesses, and essentially changing the culture that's partly to blame for why policy is just not changing. And unfortunately, in the research that I came across that was making this recommendation, no one's committing to an actual campaign. I just could not find that. So I think what's important for me to do in the final episode, my recommendations, is have some sort of tangible plan that looks like something. And hopefully I can do that. Now, something else I wanted to touch on in this episode, which I think is really important, is the government's role in supporting new fathers who have faced some problems in the workplace related to becoming a new parent. So maybe they've requested leave, be that the 2 weeks paid leave or the 52 weeks unpaid leave, or maybe they've requested flexible arrangements when returning to work so they can at least make an attempt at having some sort of sustainable work/parenting schedule. So to get to the point a little more, I'm talking about discrimination on the basis of your parental status, because the research is showing that it does indeed happen to fathers in the workplace, and it especially happens when becoming new parents. The Australian Human Rights Commission has stated that a quarter of all fathers who have taken their 2 weeks paid leave have been subjected to discrimination from their workplace, either while on leave or when returning to work. So just think about that for a second. You've taken your 2 weeks off because you have a new child, you want to get to know them, you want to get to hang out and help out, and you've got your boss calling you, giving you a hard time. That's a situation I don't think anyone wants to be in, right? And of this cohort of fathers, half reported receiving negative remarks from co-workers and management. Just under half suddenly found they had issues with their pay and their conditions and their duties, and a third had problems in trying to organise flexible work, which is something they're actually legally entitled to. So I think it's really, really important to talk about this, because it doesn't just mean you have a bad day at the office. It can have serious impacts upon the mental health and the physical health of a father, and this then goes on to affect family life and also affects financial security and also career outcomes. So how does or how should the government assist when issues of discrimination arise in the workplace? First off, we have laws. We have workplace discrimination laws, and we also have the Sex Discrimination Act 1984, which specifically outlines you must not be discriminated against on the basis of your family responsibilities. And when this does happen, we have bodies such as the Industrial Relations Commission and the Fair Work Commission to have case hearings and make a decision about whether the treatment a dad may face at work is in fact discrimination, and if it is, what action should be taken. I came across what I thought was a really interesting case back in 2015 in which 2 brothers named Craig and Cameron Zammit took their employer, the Liverpool Hospital in Sydney, to the Industrial Relations Commission over discrimination. Essentially what had happened was the 2 brothers who worked at the hospital as painters had this 8-year existing flexibility arrangement with their manager in which they started their day an hour earlier and then they finished an hour earlier. And they did this so that they could pick up their kids from school and save a ton of money on childcare fees. And so problems occurred with new management stepping in and taking over, and this new management decided, let's cancel this arrangement because we don't like it. Basically, there was no explanation. So the brothers decided, let's lodge a case against them with the Industrial Relations Commission. The part of this story that I find most concerning, beyond the fact that they even had to lodge a case, was the case verdict. The Commission made a verdict that conflicts of this nature between employee and employer, they're best solved internally between these parties themselves. So this is really interesting because the existence of bodies such as the Industrial Relations Commission or the Fair Work Commission is to solve conflicts that can't be solved within the workplace. And in the research I did, this seems to be somewhat in line with a lot of other case verdicts I looked at stemming from the Industrial Relations Commission or the Fair Work Commission, where the verdict often seemed to go in the favour of the employer who was successfully able to demonstrate that their actions weren't discrimination, or The issue was essentially passed back to the parties to solve between themselves, which could not be done in the first place, hence why they were at that commission spending a lot of money on legal fees. The reason I've mentioned this last topic is because I feel without effective mechanisms to uphold the policies we have now and policies that we might adopt in the future, it's really hard to imagine change happening at a rate that we would like to see it occur. That concludes episode 1 of the Rock Does Dishes 2 podcast, and I'd like to thank everyone for listening. Join us for episode 2, where my co-host Jack will be discussing the cultural aspects that contribute to the issues new fathers are facing in Australia.